Let's check. Making sure on my other computer that we are going, because I'm not seeing it. Let me check on my phone. Sorry for the delay, folks. Just want to make sure we have everything in place and running as it should be before we, oh yes, okay, there we go. We are live. It's just not showing up on my computer. It's showing up on my phone. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start this evening then. Thanks for everybody who's joined us. We're glad to have you tonight. Tonight we are here with Dr. Jessica Howard, and we've known Jessica at CAGT for some time, and just recently she's become a part of our board as the committee chair for the education, correct, for education. So we're really excited to have her on board at CAGT and joining our dynamic group of people who work really hard to bring you these conversations, but also to bring you our conference that will be held virtually this October. And we're just super excited to have Jessica as part of our team, but we're also super excited to have her here tonight to talk to us about how to help teens help themselves. And if you are a parent of a teen who's going to be starting high school, or who is, maybe even late middle school, and you really want to give them some tips and some pointers, actually have them join you in watching this tonight with us as we chat with Jessica. Jessica is an adjunct professor at the University of Denver, and she's a gifted education specialist through the Colorado Department of Education. She has her own educational consulting business and is the founder of the SEED program. That's SEAD. It's an excellent resource for social emotional needs for gifted students. And this program provides the social emotional learning through an online individualized platform. And hopefully she'll talk to us a little bit more about her program towards the end of her presentation tonight. Jessica, we're so glad to have you with us tonight. And we're glad to have everybody joining us and watching with us. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you chat with us about how we can help teens help themselves.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Randy. And thank you guys for inviting me to do conversations with CAGT. This is a great way to share information, especially now when we are on the computer a lot. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and you guys hopefully can see my presentation. I'm hoping to share some ways to empower our tweens, teens, and young adults tonight. In my professional life, that is what I work on a lot. I have done all of my research for my doctoral degree around what kind of social and emotional opportunities there are for secondary students and into college. And as I was going through that, I also had my own children that were growing, and I've got 3 teenagers at home. So on the personal and the professional side, I get to have a lot of experience with that. And so tonight we're going to talk about 3 different areas that really mesh together, the self-awareness, stress management, and that self-advocacy. And let me see, there we go. Over the past 4 months, we've had a lot of stressful things going on, and it's been stressful for everyone, but especially our tweens, our teens, and our young adults have had a lot of different changes and uncertainty. They've missed so many milestones. And to some adults, they can say, oh, that wasn't a big deal. Why are you worrying about that? But really, it's a big deal. This is what their world revolves around. And, it's hard enough when you have one situation, like something like the pandemic, but then there are so many other things going on that are really important, and it can be really overwhelming and scary to them. Most teens hate to admit it, but they still look to the adults in their life to give them support and that structure and understanding. And we really haven't been able to give them solid answers. And especially for our gifted kids, we're going to talk about why we need to make sure that we're cognizant when working with them. but it's really important for us. And as we move through the presentation, I am just going to say teens, but when I'm saying teens, I really am meaning our tweens and our young adults, because they're all dealing with these kinds of issues. So a question I'm often asked is, why do you look at that subgroup of those gifted tweens, teens, and young adults for support? And I definitely would never say that they should get support and someone else shouldn't. But we're finding that there are some neurological factors that really make it important for us to give some ongoing support to these kids. I love to share this definition of giftedness. It looks at more of the whole child. It was created by a group of professionals, including Linda Silverman, who will be doing one of the conversations next week. And it really brings the entire package together. And I think it's important that we don't just think of our gifted learners as kids that need higher academic opportunities, sorry. So my background is in educational psychology and neuropsychology. And when I was doing my research with secondary kids, I found Dr. Nicole Tetrault, and she's been doing a lot of work around the neurology of gifted learners. And so she's actually found that they use emotional information differently, and they often have that intensity that we'll talk about in a minute. But we've talked about that in the past when we talk about overexcitabilities. But I think it's important to bring in that research that is newer, that is telling us that it's not just what we think we see. There's actual neurological data to back up why we're talking about it. And she says that gifted individuals experience, process, and respond to the world in ways that are qualitatively different than their peers. So think about how this situation with being isolated from our friends and not really knowing what's happening and kind of the uncertainty of it all, it's hard for everyone. But for our gifted learners, it ratchets up. And that intensity makes it very tough for them to be able to deal with these situations. So we need to help them become self-aware and understand ways to deal with this stress. And that way they can really start to self-advocate for themselves. So I don't like to look at negative things first, but I think in this discussion, it'll make more sense if we look at stress, because stress management and being aware of how we deal with stress is really important. And it can really help our teens as they're trying to figure out how to self-advocate. So stress management, we think of stress sometimes as always being negative, but really if we have some ways to channel it and make it productive, it can really be a positive. But we'll start with thinking about stress when it's not dealt in a productive way. And there are many triggers, especially with our gifted learners. Many of our gifted learners are dealing with perfectionism and lots of different worries, whether those be big worries or little worries, or even situational things. And that stress, if it's not dealt with and if it's not shifted into some kind of productive channel, it moves into anxiety. And everyone experiences stress and anxiety at one time or another. The difference between them is that stress is a response to a threat in a situation, and anxiety is the reaction to the stress. So stress is supposed to be short-term. And if we can keep it short-term and keep it in a productive avenue, then we won't move into this negative trajectory. Anxiety moves us more into a long-term situation. And then when anxiety isn't treated, it often can move the child into depression. And we know that that can lead to many negative outcomes. And that's what we don't want for our kids. So we need to catch it right when we're at the stress. There's one type of anxiety that I do want to bring up because it is very common with many of our gifted learners, and that's the existential anxiety. And I love poor little Charlie Brown. He's my favorite. But these feelings of existential anxiety are feelings around big things like, what am I doing with my life? And especially right now with what we're dealing with, our teens are probably dealing with a lot of this existential anxiety. There's also existential depression, where it can become debilitating very quickly. These can come on very quickly. So I just wanted to make sure that we think about normal anxiety and our worries and things, but our gifted learners often also experience this existential anxiety. I often tell a story of when my son was 5 and he was actually wouldn't sleep for a whole week, and we were trying to figure out what was happening. And I thought maybe he didn't have somebody to sit with at lunch or something was happening. And he was worried about Greece being fiscally irresponsible with their country's money. And he had heard it on the world news, and I had no idea. And so these are the kind of worries that some of our kids have. And when you think about teens and all that they're exposed to and all that they're working on, these anxiety they can compound very quickly. So here's what we want to do. We want to move them into a positive trajectory. We want to be able to give them the tools and give them the awareness so that they can take a stressor when they encounter it, and they can implement strategies and also be open to ask for support. Now that's a tough one because a lot of teenagers do not want to ask for support. So we need to set it up in a safe space for, I usually like to practice it with small things that come up so that when big stresses come up, we can handle it. So we're going to hopefully help them build their resiliency. So they encounter a stressor, they implement strategies that we're going to talk about, some of them, and then they build resiliency as they're working through that stressful situation. We don't want to take that stressful situation away from them, because they need to learn how to deal with stress if they're going to be successful as they get older. And a lot of our kids don't come across challenge, especially when it comes to academic things and school things, as quickly as others. So we need to make sure that we give them opportunities in the rest of their life and in school to hit some of these places that are challenging. And then they can work through it with our support so that the next time they encounter a new stressor, because we know we're going to encounter stress, they'll be able to do it with more confidence. So we really want them to take that energy, and then they can practice self-advocacy as they've gotten through figuring out how to manage the stress. But the first thing we need to do, and this sounds a little strange because I love this quote though, when you can't look on the bright side, I will sit with you in the dark. It's so important for our teens to learn how to manage the stress, but first we need to acknowledge that they're feeling it. The worst thing you can do, which I think all of us have probably done, is say, oh, that's not a big deal, or why are you worrying about that? Well, to the teen or the tween or the young adult, it's really important to them. And this will help them to consciously be aware of their emotions. If we actually name that stress and say, yeah, this is tough, we're going to have to work on this. But we need to acknowledge it before we can move through. And that's where you're going to get the buy-in from the kids as well. If they think you don't think it's a big deal and it feels like the end of the world to them, you're really not going to ever have that part where they want to ask you for support. The next thing we can do as the adults, the educators, the parents, the counselors, is help them change that internal dialogue. I have found in my work over the last 20 years that teens can be really hard on themselves. And not just teens, all of us can. And that's why I love this saying, you will never speak to anyone more than you speak to yourself in your head. Be kind to yourself. It's really important, and sometimes they don't realize that they are, that they're being so cruel to themselves. They just start to do that, and it takes a lot of self-awareness and a lot of effort to do that. The next thing I like to do with them around their worries, and this covers self-awareness as well as stress management. We talk about worries. And truthfully, I love to have them just get a scrap piece of paper out and draw 2 circles. And in one circle, they write, what can I control? And in the other circle, they have to write, what do I have to let go of? What is too big for me to control? And then we can go back and start working on the things we can control. Examples of things that they can't control that I talk to clients about a lot is things like climate change, natural disasters, the pandemic. Those are big things that we need to let go of. And then we need to look at the little things and see how that we can move forward. And the things that we can control, if we're being, careful to have social distancing and wearing a mask, what can you still do? You can set up a time with your friends to meet at the park. You can go for a run. If you're really worried about climate change, I know kids have started gardening clubs and school recycling clubs. So those are the types of things that we need to help the kids understand how to do. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Lauryn Hill. I'll let you read it, so I'm not reading it to you. But I think it's really important. You have to have that self-awareness and understand that you do have different types of stress before you can move forward and really be successful. And it also needs to happen before true self-advocacy can happen. So I'm going to share a few stress relievers. I know that we have a lot of ideas around this, but with my teens, I've found these 4 seem to work the best. And it's so funny because I've had an entire volleyball team come over and make breathe bottles. Essentially, in the picture, you'll see it. I should have brought mine in. You use a water bottle, any type you want. You put glitter glue in it, and you put water, and then you shut it. And especially with the teenagers, I use super glue because they're about as bad as the toddlers in trying to take off the lid, and then you've got glitter everywhere. But it's a great way. It's like a new version of the lava lamp. And really, if the kids are just too worked up or they've come home and they've had a really rough time or a tough conversation with their best friend, have them sit there and just look at it for a few minutes. And it's extremely stress relieving. The next one is get moving, and teenagers especially. Their bodies are changing so quickly, and those tweens, you really need to get them going. That physical activity is proven to reduce stress. Another one that I see are freshmen going into college. Sometimes all of a sudden they stop working out and they're away from home. And it's just a really good way for them to combat any of that tension that they're feeling. And then something that's really simple is get up and get a glass of water. We have cortisol hormones that are stress hormones, and that will actually lower those stress hormones when you just drink water. Sounds easy, but it's a nice, quick way. And the last way is journaling. Sometimes it's difficult to get kids to journal at first. And so there have been a lot of different ways that we've done it. For parents, if I give it to them and not the parent, they're more apt to use it. Sometimes, so if you have a teacher that you can maybe say, I was hoping they could journal, or if you just put it in their room, they could do it pretty easily. But that's a way to get into self-advocating. For them to really start to understand themselves, then they can push out and do that self-advocating. And one of the biggest things we talk about is, how do I talk to my teacher about not getting what I need? Because a lot of our gifted teens feel like they, especially in this setting, I'm not learning enough in this environment, or how do I get the classes I need before we get to college? And so I just have 3 quick steps. And of course, there's tons of research around this. Deb Douglas has a fabulous book around the power of self-advocacy. But for my clients and students that I work with, I kind of break it down to these 3 things. And they all include becoming open to talk to other people. You have to understand the situation. It's a great time to talk with a trusted adult or a friend to really talk through, you know, if you don't feel like you're getting enough in this class, is there any way that you think you could? Do you need to go have someone that can help you figure out if you're really getting what you need? And that's a big step, and that might take a while. That's not something you can just do one time. It might take a week or two, and then you can decide on a goal. I usually have them do short-term goals, but if it's a long-term goal, that's great too. But then they need to write out the steps. And I usually start from the back. I usually start, where do you want to be, and how are we going to get there? But you really have to have a plan in your head. And I really like them to write it down, even if it's not in words. If it's in pictures, that's fine. And then make a plan to discuss it with the stakeholders. That's when you're going to share your hopes in a positive way. For example, you say something like, I'm so glad we're working on neuropsychology, and I've read several books on the topic. So I was wondering if I can take maybe a pre-assessment or something, and then you can see what I know. And if it's what you're going to be teaching the other kids, maybe I can do an independent project and learn about the effects of brain injury on short-term memory or something like that. So if you have a plan going in, they're more apt to agree with it. If you go in and you start whining and saying, oh my gosh, I have already learned all this. Why are you making me learn this again? That's probably not going to get them anywhere. And so we need to have a game plan. And I tell them, I'm like, you don't go into a football game without a game plan, or you don't go into a concert without practicing your music and things. You need to go into self-advocacy with a plan, and then you can move forward. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about how we as parents, counselors, and educators can really proactively support our tweens, teens, and young adults. I am a big proponent of using some sort of mentor text or mentor video to get across, you know, that discussion, because especially with our tweens and our teens and our young adults who think that they know everything by then, they really, if you can use something that's not just you telling them, that works really well. And that's actually how I created my my seed program. It's really just quick little 3 to 5 minute type videos that look at different categories, because with our gifted teenagers, they want to know what exactly is going on. What is factual and logic and those explanations, what's happening to me when I feel like this? And so I really went in, instead of just talking about the big picture, and broke it down and looked at all of these different areas, and we're adding more and more as we go. Because we give a quick overview, then we give some strategies, and then resources. Because a lot of times we don't want the book or the story or the video that we're watching. That's not the end of the conversation. That's the beginning. But that's where they can start to feel empowered. They can start to have some stake in the game. And I think that's what we miss a lot with the teens. A lot of them, I talk about low flyers a lot, and we don't, low flyers are the kids that usually are our gifted kids that don't want to let anyone know that they're struggling. They aren't the ones that are going to come to the counselor and have those discussions. So we need a way to get that information and start those tough conversations. So this is why a resource like Seed or like a mentor text, this is why they're really helpful. It really can empower the teens. And it supports those low flyers that you're not going to really get any other way. The other thing you need is an easy platform, because teenagers, man, they're going a mile a minute. They snap and they are on Insta. And so if you can give them some sort of platform, so I've created just quick little videos that they can click on, and it's self-directed. And the biggest thing for everyone involved is to be positive, be patient, and be persistent. It's going to take a while for the teens to open up, and it also is going to take a while for us to really get that relationship working in the area of self-advocacy. It's something that as adults, we still are working on how to self-advocate for ourselves. So we have to make sure that we understand these teens are going to take a while. But that is my best advice, is try and be patient. So if you have any questions, I'm not sure how Randy does the question time, if it's in the chat box or if they can ask.
Yeah, this is where I'd like you to go over a little bit about what's on this slide here. And while you're doing that, we can hopefully get some people to ask some questions. Educators who want to help students. I know there's some parents on here who have high school and middle school students who would love some advice or input on how to help their kiddos advocate for themselves, but also how to help them work through some of the stuff you talked about and help them maybe channel their stress in a better way. So while you talk about this, we'll wait for some questions to roll in.
Sounds good. The thing I found in my research, a lot of, I hit on low flyers very quickly, and that's something that I really want to make sure that everyone kind of thinks about, because, and it's a very scary thing to think about sometimes, because there are kids that can mask their emotions. We've had several suicides in the past couple of years in the Front Range area that I've worked with different families, where the kids, you know, would be masking it and talking about, you know, how they're doing, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And oftentimes that's because they were dealing with their struggles in silence. And so that was one of the big reasons that I created this entire resource. And the fun part of this resource is we can add on to it at any time. And I'm working with some great educators around the state this summer to create some lessons that can be kind of an accompaniment book, because it's great to have, a lot of times parents will watch the little videos, and then they can start some of those conversations. But I know I've gotten a lot of requests from counselors and teachers about what kind of lessons can we do around this. And so we're working on that. We're working on an accompaniment book. But it's a way, what we need to be looking at is a way to get to all of our students, whether they're our gifted students or our typical students. We need to make sure that they all receive this foundational understanding, so that they have some say and understanding in what is going on with them as they get older, and then they'll be able to really self-advocate.
Yeah, and I think you know, I've been out of school for 20 years now, and I think it's a totally different world our kids are living in now. I mean, we say a lot about social media, but I think there's a lot of pressure out there, and I think, you know, college is a worry, and affording college, and what do I do with the rest of my life? I think they're being asked earlier and earlier and earlier what they're going to do with the rest of their life. So all of these things are things I think, you know, we dealt with when I was a student, but I see it, and maybe I'm just more attuned to it, but I see it more definitely in our kids now. And so we do have a couple questions rolling in, which is great. I'm watching my comment thing. I'm like, I've got to catch back up. So we do want, one person would like to know if you could restate the Breathe Bottle recipe one more time.
Oh, of course. Well, and if you don't get it from here, if you hop on Pinterest and put in, I think Mind Jar is one of the things, in Breathe Bottle. You can use, I love to use a plastic water bottle, like a Voss, the one that's kind of like a cool cylinder. Mm-hmm. And you empty it out and you put an entire bottle, or almost that if it's a big one, of glitter glue in the bottle. And then you put some extra, usually what my clients like to do, they like to put extra different colors of glitter and things in there. Some of them even put like little toys and things mm-hmm. in little hearts or stuff like that. And then you put warm water in it, and then you shut it and you mix it up, and that's your Breathe Bottle. It's super easy.
Very easy. My daughter would love that. And she's not even a tween. She's just obsessed with all things soothing. She got on the whole ASMR kick, and it's been over with. Oh. So she'd love that. And anything made with glitter glue. Yeah. Emily Stone is viewing tonight, and she asks, What about resources for navigating the stress of tween and teen friendships? Anyway, it just jumped on me. Especially for our GT kids who don't always clue into the nuances of those teenage friend relationships.
Oh, that is such an important question. And because a lot of times, actually, some of my other presentations that I do, we look at those aspects of being gifted and how they really relate to some of these other things. We have that acute sense of justice. We have sometimes not being able to tell those social cues. We have a lot of things, that asynchronous development. And so I actually am going to share, I told Nanette and Randy that I have an entire list. Actually, it's like 3 pages now. I've just been making it larger every year, of different resources that we talk about. In SEED, one of the categories that I work on is I have an entire video on relationships and friendships. And it's talking about, you know, how do you have those conversations? How do you become a good friend? And those are really important, but a lot of our kids are going to need more than that. And so I do have a section that talks about, you know, lots of good introspective ways to think about, you know, when I'm having a conversation, what can I do to make sure that I'm involved and my friends know that I care about what they're saying? Because that tends to be the biggest issue we have. Listening and doing active listening, that's something I do with a lot of my clients. We practice active listening, and we practice what it's like to really be in tune to someone else's thoughts in their conversation and not jump to exactly what we want to share. So I will share that resource with some of those other resources. But my biggest tool, I guess, and strategy I use is really practicing conversations and active listening with the teen. I mean, making it very direct. They need that.
Oh yeah, and Emily said, thank you so much, very helpful. We just actually had this conversation with my 11-year-old I was talking to you about earlier. He'll be 12 soon, but we've had to say, hey bud, you know, when we're talking about something and then you interject with something about a, you know, prehistoric rodent that he's really interested in, we have to say, hey, you know, that's really not what we're talking about, and you're not contributing to the conversation at large. And so how can you wait until the appropriate time in the conversation to share that? And he's actually checked himself a couple times, but it's been a challenge. But yeah, you know, sometimes just things seem really pertinent in that exact moment.
And I have actually had clients, and then my own, my son, when he was younger, if he would have something that he really wanted to share and he was worried he'd forget it, I actually got him this teeny little notebook that he carries around still all the time. And I'll like jot it down, and then we can talk about it next. And that, it is a struggle, but it's really good for them. And that moves us back into that self-awareness piece, because if we don't have self-awareness, we can't really move on to those other areas of, you know, trying to move on and have relationships and friendships if we aren't even aware of our own intentions, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenny Mead Tarbox is on here and said she's also experienced a lot of gifted kids who just want to feel less awkward and are much more able to converse with adults about topics. So I know about 100 of those.
Yeah, and they will want to stay in at lunch and hang out with you instead of going. Or if they've got an off block, you see them hanging around, you know, the library or where they think their favorite teachers will be. Mm-hmm. And they really try to avoid, because usually and that's understandable, they've got interests that sometimes their peers just, you know, aren't interested in. So finding that middle ground, finding something with your age group peers that you can talk to them about. Usually, you know, you can talk about gaming or something like that they might be interested in, or football or a sport. And then you can still have those higher level conversations with people of different ages. But that is something that it's really hard to get, you know, to do the little push and say, try it.
Yeah.
And then let them have the conversations with you too. It's great, it's a great outlet if you can do both.
Yes, and I think we need to help kids with that because of the it can be very isolating. I've had lots of students come to my office and say, well, I just don't feel like anybody gets what I'm saying about this, and I really need to talk about the trade deal with China, or I really need to talk about, and they just need somebody who they think will like look at them cross-eyed and go, we were talking about prom, dude, So I think, giving them those skills so they don't feel as isolated would be really great.
And letting them be okay. And it's, it's okay if they want to have those kind of conversations, because they start to feel like they're the only ones. Yeah. And especially if they're in more of a rural school, or if they're in a setting where they don't have peers that would be excited about that, they start to second guess if they're okay. And that's something that we need to hear as their support system, to be like, yeah, that's cool. That's how your brain works.
And Rosa Medina, also our CAGT member, and she actually operates the Latino Facebook. She asked, she would love some recommendations of good movies to watch with teens that will help start the conversation. Are there any movies that kind of help kids talk about maybe the way they're feeling about themselves and their identities that you could recommend?
I'm going to have to look into that. I know I was just having a conversation with a colleague about that, and we said that we needed to make a list, because there are some of these movies that while we were all at home in my house, we were all writing down movies, and we'd put them in a bowl, and every night we'd pick one. Mm-hmm. And so we would watch, Stand and Deliver, and some of these shows that were about true stories. But I started to think, I know that there are good examples in movies. And so I will try, as an answer, I'm going to try and put together some information around that. But I think you can hop on and YouTube some of these TED Talks, especially the youth TED Talks. I used to go every year when it was in Denver for the youth TED Talks. And a lot of them, some of them aren't necessarily talking about relationships and friendships, but a lot of them you could really start a good conversation around, this is how this kid worked in his world, but how could we have pulled in another, how could we have grown his experience by incorporating some relationships in that and things like that. So I'll try and get together some options.
TED Talks, as you were talking about, like mentor videos and stuff, TED Talks are great mentor videos to kind of get conversations going. Oh, we got another question here. Eileen, she's actually one of my fellow Fort Morganites, asks, do you have any recommendations for encouraging social interactions with peers under our current social distancing situation? Just watching her daughter get more isolated over the past several months and not having as many opportunities to socialize, and how can we encourage some of that interaction in the current situation that we're in?
It's been really hard, especially with the younger, the tweens, to have them be in a setting where they can have that friendship and that interaction. So what I've told, and it starts, you can start as young as elementary, setting up, and the parents for the younger ones need to help, but setting up some of these virtual rooms and things like that, so the kids can actually, it's very safe, but they can all watch the same movie at the same time and be able to talk about it, or they can all be playing a game and be able to talk about it. What my teens did, I have 16-year-old twin daughters, and they were each in their separate room, and I went in and they were all watching. One of them was on her computer watching a movie and talking on the phone on FaceTime with all of their friends, and I went in the other one and she was on the same FaceTime, and everybody has to think about it differently. But the nice thing, I guess, about this generation, they are digital natives, and it's still never going to be as good as like just sitting next to your buddy on the couch, sharing popcorn, watching a movie. But you definitely need to have that opportunity to be with them real time. FaceTime's been great. Google Hangout's been great. For the older teens, what they've been doing is heading over to either the elementary parking lot, a high school parking lot, and parking their cars so that they're distanced away and having these conversations. And it's been really interesting to listen to the different teens' takes on that. And sometimes it's actually having more conversations happening because they're not so busy with doing, you know, going from sports to this to that. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, try and think outside the box of a way that you can support them in having some real-time interaction, and not just, not just like a video game where they can talk, they have someone else that's playing it, but really how they can have some sort of video link so they actually see each other. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And you mentioned the movies at Netflix, you can do like watch parties, I think.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun.
Those
are all great suggestions. I think, we're just also at a point where like, we're so over Zoom, but at the same time, maybe we just need to endure it and embrace the fact that the technology at least exists so that we can do that. Anne had a question. Other than your earlier suggestions for dealing with existential stress and anxiety, what would help a highly gifted 16-year-old, one that's also twice exceptional, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, who attends community college versus high school? So already out of high school, going to community college, and is feeling overwhelmed by climate change, and feeling we aren't doing enough fast enough, beyond the suggestion of like the recycling and the small things. He was part of a group that got his mountain town to ban plastic bags. He feels as though our leaders are ignoring real and actionable advice. Oh, science ignoring. I love it.
Yep.
It happens so much. Any ideas for quelling his deep anxieties?
That's a great question. And it's a hard one to answer. It's probably not something that's going to be able to just be a one-time shot to help him feel better. He's going to need to have a long-term goal, in whether that is, starting to, like you said, he did a campaign to rid the plastic bags. Activities like that are going to be really helpful, but he truly would probably benefit most from having a psychologist that can talk to him about ways that he's going to be able to, the ways that he can control things and the ways that he can't. Because for kids that are dealing with so many different issues, and he's already up there in the college realm, his asynchronous development is probably very wide in between where he's thinking and some of his social or emotional feelings towards things. And so he's the type of kid I would make sure to try and find a therapist that understands twice exceptionality. That's huge, because if they go in and they just are trying to work on anxiety from a typical viewpoint, that's not going to do it. They need to be cognizant that this kiddo is on a different plane when it comes to how he is looking at anxiety, and that existential piece is really important, and it's going to then cause him to need some different supports. But unfortunately, with a situation like that, I don't think there's a good quick answer for that. But he definitely needs a plan, like something where he can be in a group. Oftentimes colleges will have different groups that work on areas and in situations like that. So I would say that's something that I would look into and see if the college has some kind of groups, and that way that would pull in that peer environment. Even though they're older, I think he'd be good with something like that.
And I think that's, I think that sometimes those worries, because sometimes a lot of times kids feel, and I felt like this when I was a teen, that no one else was worrying about the same things I was worrying about. And it's a very isolating feeling. And I think a lot of times as a gifted teen, sometimes we feel like we're walking around in these exteriors that don't necessarily reflect the interiors. Like you put on an air, about like, I'm going to look like a 16-year-old, but my mind is not functioning on that level. Or I'm going to look like a 14-year-old, but I'm worrying about adult problems, but I have to hide that inside and act like a different person around my peers. But I like the idea of like finding people who feel as passionately and joining a group that wants to work towards a more common goal. And I think feeling less alone in your concerns and feeling like you're working towards something with someone is huge. You hear all these things about these great 16-year-olds who invent these cleanup things in the ocean, and I think those are the kind of things we can look for these kiddos who really feel like they need to do something to enact change.
And that's why I go back to the youth TED Talks. I've just been blown away. There are venues, and granted, they're going to look different now, but a lot of these kids, even though they might have passions in different areas, they're able to find others that have passions. They're just as passionate about whatever issue it is they're working on. And I saw that a lot at the youth TEDx. So those kinds, it's harder to find, but if you can find outlets and conferences are great for these young kids. I love seeing every year when the young kids come to CAGT and they come to the conference and they're just so excited to see other kids that have some commonalities that they might not see every day in school. And so it's tough to, and it doesn't mean that they'll be best friends or they'll click, but to have some sense of knowledge that there are other people that think the same way you do. It's pretty empowering to them.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. I think that it's hard, especially when you talk about like Anne's question, small mountain town, and got my son out here who lives in a small rural town, and not everybody around wants to talk about prehistoric rodents. And I said, let's make a podcast. Let's do a podcast. Let's do something. Put your ideas out there and see who comes to you and who you can create a group of people who you get you and get what you get. And I think that finding their tribe is really important for our gifted kids. And I think that really helps with that, empowering them, but helping with the social isolation, also helping with anxiety and so many other things. I feel like having a tribe really lifts you up.
Yes. And I heard a gentleman that was either at Lockheed or Bell many years ago. He came in and he was talking to a group of kids that had done the Explorer test and had, actually these were all the kids that had ranked at the top 10th percentile of the nation. And so he was giving a speech and he said, I'm not worried about how you're going to do with your academics as you continue through, or with, where you go and what you create. He said, what I'm really concerned about is that you are worried that you don't have anyone, your tribe. And he said, you might not find your people, he called them your people, until you get to college, if you're in one of these smaller towns. And he said, so you have to just know that you're gonna, this is where I think social media is great, and technology. You can push out a podcast and you can have people come to you that way. But in your everyday life, he said, hang on, you will find your people when you get into college or when you get into your career. You'll find those people. And in the meantime, you have to know that you're not alone and they're out there. You just have to figure out how to find them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We've got time for one more question, and it comes from Rosa again. And she mentions that, reflecting back to the comment about therapists who work with gifted students and gifted individuals. If you had to give advice to therapists who work with teens on anxiety, what would they do differently when it comes to gifted kids with existential anxiety?
That is such a good question, Rosa. Well, thinking about the psychologists and how a lot of them do cognitive behavioral therapy with our teens. And the first thing that they need to do, that might be a little different for our gifted kids, is to dig down a little deeper and figure out the root of the issue. So which I know that therapists will do that with everyone. But with our gifted kids, they need to understand that as a therapist, they might need to dig in a different way, because it might, you know, like even with my son when he was little and I thought he didn't have someone to sit with at lunch, I made that assumption. And I think therapists that work with gifted students need to really be careful not to make assumptions about what they've seen in the past with other clients, because we know that each of our kids, especially when we're looking at twice exceptionality or kids dealing with that existential anxiety that's so big, we're going to have to delve in and do some work about where the root problem is. Like for my son, and he was little, he wasn't a teen, but he saw something in the news, and there was that kernel of truth that he was worried about, and it just got bigger and bigger, and it snowballed. With our teenagers, that happens a lot. They are getting a lot of input that we as parents and educators might not even know about. I realized that my daughter, she was talking about an issue, and I had no idea that it had even crossed, her phone, and she was talking about it, and it was so upsetting to her, but I didn't know where her worry was coming from until I finally dug down, and I was like, oh, you saw the story about, and I can't even remember what it was about, but it was a story that came across her news feed on her phone. And she was just having the worst time trying to think about it. And she didn't want to talk to me because she didn't want me to worry about that. She was worried about it. And so I think that that's what therapists, and, hopefully they're doing that with all their clients, but I think they need to understand that, that the root cause of some of the things that our gifted teens worry about may not look like your normal pathway or avenue that you would take. So I hope that helps a little.
Excellent. Well, I think, these are these kind of the questions that I think parents of gifted teens probably worry about most. And I think, so, I think we can go on and talk about this, but I definitely think, if people have further questions, your contact information is on this. We're recording everything. Yes, pull that up one last time. We are recording, we record these and post them to our website. They can always rewatch this on Facebook. If they want to reach out to you, they can. I think looking up therapists again who have background in gifted is very important. And we appreciate everything you've had to share with us tonight. I really think I want to go back just real quick and talk about that positive stress and how we can help our kids kind of reach towards the positive and find the positive and use that as a growing point, because I think that's something we overlook. And so I really appreciate what you had to share with us tonight, Jessica. And I hope that, and I know Jessica, you might be tuning in next week too, because we have Linda Silverman on. And Linda will be here to talk about the visual spatial learner and how we kind of need to work on meeting those needs of those kiddos in the classroom and strategies to help teach those students and identify those students. So she's a great presenter. I know, Jessica, you work with her, and we have worked with her through CAGT for many, many conferences and many presentations. So we're excited to have her on next Tuesday, same time, same place. And we just appreciate you taking the time out of your day, Jessica, to share this with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And actually, Rose's question would be fabulous to ask Linda, because she has so much experience as a psychologist. So I would
tune in next week.
Yep.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. We will talk to you all later. Have a great night.